Hi, everybody, and welcome to the live stream tonight. You are about to go on a whirlwind tour of the Lori Vallow Daybell triple, really quadruple murder case. It's a case like no other in America. We're going to be talking about zombies, a secret storage unit, a strange Burger King incident, reincarnation, marriages extending through multiple lives, light and dark spirits, and most importantly, the mysterious deaths and multiple heinous murders, including of two children. At the center of it all is Lori Vallow Daybell, known as the Doomsday Mom because of all the deaths around her, as well as her religious beliefs about the end of days. Now, the jury has been picked, and her murder trial starts on Monday with opening statements. This case has even more twists and turns than the Murdaugh case, and I know that our group has been very intrigued by that case. So the goal that my guest and I'm going to introduce her in just a second, have is for you to be able to watch one video, and from that one video be caught up and know where the case stands, what the issues are, understand the case as we head into trial. There'll be new things at trial, of course. The prosecution's been pretty secretive, so we will get a lot more facts. We have a super special guest. I have been so excited waiting for her to come on. Lori Hellis is a retired criminal defense attorney. She's a veteran, and she is a true crime author. She has been following this case and is currently writing what I have no doubt will be the definitive book on this case. It's going to be called Children of Light and Darkness, the Lori Vallow story. She also has a YouTube channel herself. We'll get to all of that. I've linked it in the description below. And she's already even a published author on divorce for millennials. She wrote the book, The No Nonsense Guide to Divorce. So, Lori, I think probably the most notable thing is you moved just for this case. You are all in. Tell us about that.
Well, I did. When I retired, I was practicing in Bend, Oregon. I retired thinking that I wanted to retire and write, and moved to the Phoenix area thinking that I wanted to be able to sit on my patio in November and write. And but true crime was not on my bingo card when we got started. So what I got interested in the case. I learned about it pretty early on, and got interested in following it. And at one point thought, I think this is a book. So here I am.
And I have a question about that. I told you I'd ask you this question in advance. And you don't have to give us a lot, because we'll just tease people with this as we go through it. We'll get to it again. What was the moment in time when you said you're reading the articles about this case, you're learning about it, and you said, this isn't just a case that I'm interested in. This is a book. Somebody needs to write this book. What was the moment when that happened for you?
Well, I started following it because I was living in the Phoenix area, and Justin Lum from Fox 10 was covering it very closely because he had been covering Charles Vallow's death. That's Lori's number 4 husband. And so he was talking about missing children. So that got my radar up. I joined a couple of Facebook groups, and it really wasn't until the children's bodies were found and all of these really unusual beliefs started surfacing that I thought, this is a book.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of that very first death, I want to add this to the stream so we can both see it. I did a chart because it's kind of difficult to track all of the people. And just to sort of give people an overview, Lori Vallow Daybell, as I said, at the center of the case, it's her trial that's started now with jury selection, and opening statements will be Monday. Lori is at the center. She was married 5 times. Those are the 5 pink arrows. You can see Nelson Yanes, William LaGoya, Joe Ryan, Charles Vallow, and Chad Daybell, all married to Lori. Now, Lori had 3 children, one with each of 3 separate husbands. She also had a brother and a sister, Stacy and Alex. And then Chad, of course, had a wife, Tammy Daybell, when he first met Lori. Now, the way I've done this is Everyone who is now deceased, I put their circle in red. So so that you can sort of see all of the things that had gone on around Lori Vallow Daybell. So you can see here that her sister Stacy, her brother Alex have both already died. And I put the date in there so you can see. Not Stacy Cox Cope, the sister, died a good long time ago in 1998. Alex Cox, though, died right in the period of time when all of the other people did. He died in December 2019. Then Lori's husband, Joe Ryan, died in April of 2018. Tylee Ryan died a little bit over a year later in 2019. Charles Vallow, Lori's fourth husband, also died. J.J. Vallow, his son, their son, also now deceased. And the murder trial does not represent all of the people who are in red, all of the people who have died. The murder trial is for Tylee Ryan, J.J. Vallow, and then Tammy Daybell. Those three are the only ones represented. But it's hard to understand the Lori Vallow case if you don't see all of this around her and don't understand what's really happening. So, Lori, I wanted to start off with the Joe Ryan part of the case. Now, Joe and Lori married back in 2001. He adopted her son, Colby, and they had Tylee, but they got divorced in 2005, and it was very much not smooth. Can you tell us a little bit about that relationship after their divorce?
So first of all, as far as we know, Joe Ryan never legally adopted Colby. They did a legal name change for him, which doesn't change parental rights. So his legal name was Ryan, but he was never legally adopted by Joe. So then they had Tylee together, and Tylee was very young, 2.5 or 3, when they divorced. It was an incredibly hostile, conflict-ridden divorce. And they literally fought over Tylee's custody until the day Joe Ryan died. He moved all over the country following them to try and be close to Tylee so he could visit with her. It was a heavily conflicted situation. At one point, he had not seen Tylee in quite some time. So they were all living in Texas, in Austin, I think. And at one point, he was ordered to have his initial visits with Tylee at a supervised location where there would be pickups and drop-offs would be supervised. And as Joe was coming out of that supervised parenting time, Alex Cox was waiting in the parking lot for him and took after him with a taser. Joe wasn't sure. He thought it was a gun, but it was a taser. And Alex was under the impression, I guess, that if he tased Joe in his heart, it would kill him. And that was what he was attempting to do. Joe spotted him coming after him and turned. He tased him in the back. He actually tased him twice. Joe fell down, broke a wrist, and also had some heart arrhythmia as a result, and ended up going to the hospital for a couple of days. Alex Cox served under a year, I think about 9 months in prison for that incident. He was prosecuted, and he was a wannabe stand-up comedian, so he later worked it into his stand-up comedy routine. But he was, according to his comedy routine, he was utterly convinced that Joe Ryan had sexually abused both of the children. So those allegations were thrown about, but there was never any evidence. There was never any. Joe Ryan went through multiple evaluations, and including sex offender evaluations, and he was never. It was never proven. So it's impossible at this point to say. Tylee's gone. Colby Ryan does say it happened, but they were both very young, and there was a lot of evidence that Lori was coaching them.
And Tylee ultimately recanted, didn't she?
She did.
She did. So
Yeah.
now, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's right. I was just
Okay.
answering. She did.
Okay. Joe Ryan died of what was believed to be a heart attack, alone in his apartment, all the doors and windows locked, in 2018. Now, the police, after all of the things were discovered with Lori Vallow Daybell, opened up the case again, but they again concluded it was of natural causes. There were a number of really suspicious circumstances, though, that gave pause and concern. And I know the sister of Joe Ryan has said she wishes that he had not been cremated, but there's no really going back and figuring out from an autopsy what exactly happened to him. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what some of those circumstances are that surrounded the death of Joe Ryan and that made people concerned.
Well, first of all, it was unattended, which is always suspicious. He was alone in his apartment, as you say. He had some health issues, but nothing that would have risen to the level of being life-threatening. The other issues were that Lori was his next of kin, and she was the one who determined that his body would be cremated because he was still listed as her next of kin, even though they had been divorced forever. So there was that. And during that time, Lori had also made a podcast where she admitted that at one point she was planning to kill him and decided to turn her life to the temple instead. So it definitely raised some red flags. I know that they reopened the investigation, but as you say, they had limited information to go on. They had a few tissue samples that they were able to retest, but it's important to know that toxicology is not an exact science. It's not as if you can take a tissue sample, put it in a machine, and it will spit you out a result. In order to test for certain samples, you have to test for each individual chemical or poison, and it's very hard to spot if it's something that is not common or isn't commonly used, or it's something that is naturally occurring. Lori's elder sister Stacy was a type 1 diabetic and also had some pretty severe eating disorders because of having grown up as a young child with issues around her eating because of her diabetes. And she died a death unattended by everyone except Alex Cox. So there's really no way to know whether she was improperly medicated or not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. And I think that there was one of the other things I read was a sort of double for lawyers. We'll call this hearsay within hearsay, something like that. But where a friend of Lori's said that Lori told friends of theirs, mutual friends, that she had paid Alex Cox to murder Joe Ryan. And so that didn't come back as clear evidence, you could admit, but it came back as more smoke to suggest that maybe there's fire underneath there.
Right.
And I guess one other thing that did happen was, my understanding is that Tylee got some funds as a result of Joe Ryan's death. And that's one of the same things that the prosecution is contending that Lori and Chad did when all of the other people died. It wasn't just that they had religious beliefs that caused them to do this. It was also that they had a financial incentive that was built in to at least 2 of the 3 victims.
Right. My understanding is, well, 3 if you count Tylee, Charles, and then Tammy. But my understanding is that she there was an insurance payout of somewhere around $175,000, and that went to Tylee. And one of the things that, as you said earlier, Idaho has kept the discovery pretty close to the chest.
Mhm.
So we don't have information about that yet, but I'm certain it will be presented at trial. So
Right,
um,
right,
we're picking these things up from, as you say, hearsay from other people around them who should or most likely did know what the inheritance was and who was responsible for it.
right, right.
We know that after Tylee died, or actually it could have been shortly before, Lori transferred all of Tylee's money into her name.
I did not know that. Okay, that's that's pretty powerful evidence. I'll be interested to learn what they have for that. Well, I want to talk now about the next column, if you will, Charles Vallow, who died in July 2019, and JJ Vallow, his son. Of course, we'll get to the victims last of all, but with Charles Vallow, now at the time he died, they were in the midst of divorcing. They had been married from 2005 to 2019. They had adopted JJ together. He was not their natural child, but he was the grandson of Charles's sister, Kay. And
Correct.
so Charles and Lori had adopted JJ. Now, in 2018, and ultimately we know that Charles Vallow was shot dead by Alex Cox, Lori's brother. We know that because that's admitted by Lori, by Alex, by Tylee. All of that was admitted. Now, exactly what the circumstances were, we'll sort of tease through that as we talk. But in 2018, we know that Lori meets Chad. Do we know exactly when they met? We know it was sometime in 2018, but when?
Pretty clearly, I'd have to go back through my notes to get the exact dates, but it was October. It was at a Preparing a People conference in St. George, Utah. And she went there with her best friend, Melanie Gibb. Now, Preparing a People was a group of people who were preparing for the end times. They were, for lack of a better word, doomsday preppers. And this conference was all about how to keep your water supply fresh and how to store your food. But they also invited speakers who came to talk about what the end times would be like. And Chad Daybell was one of those who claimed he had had a near-death experiences that had caused his veil with the other side to be thin. So he was receiving visions from God about what was going to happen in the end times. This is a very common theme within this group of LDS folks who are a little bit on the fringe. So it's a common theme. And
Right.
several authors who talked about their near-death experiences. So Chad also wrote fiction, poorly, but he had a bit of a following, and all of those books, which he later claimed were not fiction but were visions, had to do with the coming tribulation and building the new Zion. So.
Is that the same as the Preparing a People Time to Warrior Up podcast that Lori and Chad did together?
Well, it's kind of interesting because they were affiliated with this Preparing a People group, and the group was promoting their podcast up until people became suspicious about them. There actually was another author. His name is Jason Mow, M-O-W. Had to think a minute. There's so many people sort of peripherally involved in this case. He wrote historical fiction, and he had a podcast he called Time to Warrior Up. Lori and Melanie Gibb, her friend, were on that podcast several times and then started their own podcast and titled it the same thing. So Preparing a People was promoting their podcast, but they weren't necessarily sponsored by PAP. There was another website called Avow, another voice of warning. They were a little bit more talking about the apocalypse is coming and it's going to be soon. And so they were definitely more urgent. There was more urgency in that group than there was in Preparing People.
All right. So at this stage, it's 2018. Chad is married to Tammy. Lori is married to Charles Vallow. The indictment against them says that they began all the way in October 2018, which is substantially before the deaths, a year possibly, that they began discussing how their religious beliefs could justify killing Tammy, JJ, and Tylee. That's an allegation in the complaint. So, and about this time, there is, at least in Charles Vallow's mind, a shift in what Lori Vallow is talking about and believing. And in January of 2019, he goes to the police and asks them to give Lori a mental health, some kind of mental health help, an exam, do something. Let's talk about that. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Charles came home from a business trip. Charles was a financial planner and he traveled a great deal for business. He came home from a business trip, discovered that Lori had canceled his airline flight, taken his truck out of the long-term parking at the airport, and then gotten rid of all of his belongings. And when he discovered that she had canceled his flight, then he booked another flight, came home. He was very concerned about the children. And when he got to the house, he was locked out. She'd changed all the locks on the doors. So he met with the police and he tried to explain to them at that point. She thinks she is an exalted being. She thinks she's a goddess. She thinks she doesn't have to eat anymore. She thinks that that she's going to lead the 144,000. He's trying to explain to them. Now, I will say the Phoenix area has a pretty good size population of LDS members. So he did find one of the police that he was talking to said, yeah, okay, I understand what you're saying, because the other one was like, what in the heck are you talking about? But he was able to explain that he was deeply concerned about her because of all of these very unusual beliefs, and that she had been threatening him, that he was not himself, that his body had been taken over by a dark spirit named Ned Schneider, and that the only way to rid a body of its dark host is to kill the body and allow the spirit to escape. So he had been told she could murder him with her powers. I mean, it was scary stuff. But Lori was this bubbly, blonde bombshell. She was always perfectly dressed, perfectly made up, did lots of yoga and Pilates, danced 2 or 3 hours in her house every night. She was fit, she was attractive, and she had this cheerleader personality. And so it was very easy for her to sweet talk, for lack of a better description, the police. And, you know, they looked at her and said, we don't think there's anything wrong with you. You seem pretty lucid to us. And that was the end of the mental health evaluation.
And maybe ultimately to Charles too, because he filed for divorce and then stopped the proceedings for a period of time, so that in the end, they were not actually divorced by the time he was killed, even though he had at one point started as if he was going to move forward with that. Right. And one thing I read about, and I didn't really find much about it at all was that her family, Lori's family, said that she had disappeared to Hawaii for 2 months in roughly February 2019. She left the kids behind with other people and she headed out for 2 months. What was the deal with that? Do we know anything about that?
She and Charles were in the midst of, he had filed for divorce. She left Tylee with her brother Alex and JJ with his dad, Charles, and up and left for Hawaii. Her good friend who lived in Hawaii and who she stayed with said there was this huge change in Lori. She was manic. She came with a suitcase full of papers and she was constantly shuffling through papers and writing notes and trying to prove to April that all of this was happening, that the end was coming. She believed that July 21st of 2020 would be when God would come again, the tribulation would begin. And so she was frantic trying to get people to get on board. And she told her friend April, you need to leave your children and you need to come with me and follow me because we're going to lead the faithful and protect you from the tribulation, from the earthquakes. And yeah. So
let's go ahead and talk about that because Lori's views about religion were changing in this period. And let's talk a little bit about the concept that of the change in, let's just talk in general about the whole zombie concept, the concept of people who are occupied or possessed, I guess you might call it, by dark spirits. Let's talk about what she thought that meant.
Well, that's a good question. And I want to point out that I'm not LDS. I have spent a lot of time earnestly studying and trying to educate myself about the faith. But I was not raised in the faith the way that people who are members of the church typically are. Lori was raised in the church. So she was raised with the church history, and that's just important to point out. The church, there are some tenets in the church which easily get sort of conflated with other ideas, if you will. The first one is that the LDS faith believes very centrally in personal revelation. They believe that their president, their leader of the church, receives personal revelation and guides the church. And if the prophet decides to revise church history because God told him to, he does. And it's a very patriarchal hierarchy. And so the next person that comes along is the husband, who's the patriarch of the family. He gets the priesthood and it's bestowed on him, and he is responsible for having revelations for his family. So there's that. There's also within the doctrine, there is a very clear belief that there are minions of Satan, that there are demons who are Satan's army, who are here on earth and whose job it is to warp and to take away from Jesus all of the LDS followers. So they believe that they are fighting constantly against the devil and his forces. So we put those two things together. The other thing is that the church has been somewhat revisionist in its history. Joseph Smith had a revelation that he wanted his followers to participate in polygamy. For many years, the church denied that Joseph Smith ever practiced polygamy and blamed it all on his predecessor or his successor, Brigham Young. So the church has always sort of revised their history a bit, and it has really only been in the last 10 years when the church hasn't been able to control the message because the internet's out there, that people have begun to point at LDS history and say, but it said this. So into that comes these people who feel like they're hearing the same stuff over and over again in church, and they want to level up in their beliefs and their faith. And they start doing research into the documents that come out of Joseph Smith's time. And there is indication that Joseph Smith believed, at least in passing, in that people could be reborn. It's not exactly reincarnation, because they're only reincarnated as other people and not as animals or bugs, or like the Hindu belief. But there is this belief in reincarnation. There is this belief in polygamy. And what comes out of that is a group of people who now believe that they have lived past lives, and that in many cases they have been married to someone in past lives. The church also, the mainstream church, believes that people ascend into the celestial kingdom, and that marriages and families transcend death. So they believe that marriages and families continue in the celestial kingdom. So you put all that together and you get this group of folks who now believes dark spirits are walking on the earth and are taking over people's bodies. And they are calling those people zombies, because it is the era of The Walking Dead. And they also believe that they have been lived many past lives, and that they potentially have been married to people in past lives. And they also believe that polygamy is to be practiced both on earth and in the celestial kingdom. So now those are not mainstream beliefs, but they are beliefs that have been brought from the mainstream history.
So all of that is what the prosecution is going to say is motivation. It's motive for how, in the end, Lori and Chad were able to justify killing people. But let's go now to the actual shooting death of Charles Vallow by Alex Cox, because what happens is that Charles Vallow is coming to pick up Tylee. He's coming to see her. Lori has her brother, Alex Cox, stay at the house that night. So he's there that morning. There's a confrontation. Everybody's outside of the house except for Alex and Charles. Alex shoots Charles. But there is testimony, and I have here a couple of pictures. There was testimony. There was an interview by the police of Tylee. This is Tylee in the chair. And Tylee said, Charles Vallow was threatening us with a bat, and he was being very violent and very aggressive. She 100% towed the party line on it was his fault. And then there was also, of course, an interview with Lori Vallow Daybell, just Lori Vallow at the time, but there was an interview of her following this. And then probably most confusingly, immediately after the shooting and the death of Alex Cox, and there's confusion about whether people went back in or didn't, whether they stepped over the body, what they did. But then, strangely, Lori Vallow is captured going through the Burger King drive-thru, taking the kids to school right after this murder. The police are coming back there where it all happened, but she's taking the kids through the drive-thru. Well, we didn't have a chance to get breakfast. And so the whole casual approach to it raised some concerns in the police department, even at the time. And so let's talk about a little bit about the issues around the shooting of Charles Vallow. Now, and I want to be clear, we still haven't even gotten to the murders that are actually going to be tried starting on Monday. Charles Vallow is, however, a murder for which Lori Vallow is being charged with conspiracy. She is being charged with conspiring with her brother Alex, who is now dead, to kill Charles Vallow. So that is something she's being charged with. It's not outside the realm. It's just not in this particular case starting Monday.
Not in this case. So
Right.
at the time, Charles and Lori were living in Chandler, Arizona. And so Charles's murder happened in Arizona. And here is the scenario. Charles and Lori were separated. He was living back down in Houston, and he flew in because he was going to visit JJ. His plan was to pick JJ up, take him to school, and then
I said Tylee, and I didn't mean JJ.
Right.
Sorry. Yeah.
That's okay. His plan was to take, so some of this makes a little bit of sense. His plan was to take JJ to breakfast at his hotel and then to school. So JJ had not had breakfast. So the next thing that happens is Lori, knowing Charles is coming that morning, has her brother Alex stay overnight. It's very unusual for him to do that. And he shows up with his gun in a gun case. He then stays the night. Everybody gets up in the morning. Now, the story starts out that Charles and Lori get into an argument because she takes his telephone and is looking at it to accuse him of some untoward behavior. And so they're fighting over the phone. Tylee hears this dust up and decides that she's going to come out and brings a bat with her. None of this really makes any sense, but this is the story. So there's this confrontation. Tylee's got the bat. Charles takes the bat away from her. And so according to Lori, she is in the house. Alex says Charles threatened him with the bat. According to Lori's police interview, she was in the house, but in the hall around the corner from the living room, and heard the shot, and then took her children and rushed them outside. Tylee says she took JJ out because her mom told her to. Lori says she rushed the kids outside, realized she didn't have her purse, and sent Tylee back into the house to get her purse when they heard the gunshots going off as they were walking out the door. I don't know why you'd send your teenager back into that melee after you'd heard gunshots. I don't know. Alex claims that Charles hit him in the back of the head with the bat, and that he shot Charles in self-defense. That really doesn't add up, because one of the shots that Alex fired, he fired when Charles was already on the ground, and he fired a coup de grace shot. So Lori grabs the kids. JJ is a special needs child. He's autistic and going to a school for autistic students. It makes a certain amount of sense that she wanted to keep things normal for him. He hadn't had breakfast yet, so she ran him through the drive-thru before she dropped him off at school. However, she and Tylee left the house barefooted. So the next thing that happens is they go to Walgreens and buy flip-flops. It isn't until almost an hour later that she comes back. Alex, the timeline doesn't add up. The best that the police can say is that Alex waited about 45 minutes before he called 911. He said the shooting had happened 5 minutes before, but in reality, it was 45 minutes. And Charles was already well and dead by then.
And within just days of that killing, that shooting, Chad writes a very sexual romance novel about to Lori Vallow. They called each other code names. He called himself James. He called her Alina. And he wrote this by text to her, sending it in pieces across text about this sexual romance novel about her. That's within days of the death of her then husband, even though they were going through divorce proceedings. And then he's still married. He's still married to someone else, to Tammy. Then by the end of August, this was July, and then by the end of August, Lori and Alex have moved to Rexburg to be near, or in fact are near now, Chad. They're near right. Chad Daybell. And then shortly after that, on September 8th, is the last day we see Tylee. That's the last time anyone saw her. She was photographed at Yellowstone National Park with her brother JJ, with Alex, with Lori, and then we don't see any more from her. Ironically, it's also the same day that Chad and Tammy signed an application to increase the life insurance for Tammy to the maximum they were able to get.
Right.
So let's talk about the last time that Tylee was seen in that Yellowstone National Park day.
So one detail that I think we need to add in is that Charles Vallow had $1 million life insurance policy. Lori knew that. He was a financial planner, insurance guy, and she knew he had this $1 million life insurance policy. When he initially initiated divorce proceedings, he changed his beneficiary from Lori to his sister, Kay Woodcock. And Lori did not know that. It wasn't until there's a whole lot of other things that were suspicious. She changed his password on that insurance policy and locked him out of it. So he had to write letters to change his beneficiary. So she was trying to keep him away from being able to change his beneficiary, but he managed it. So she was very upset about the fact that she wasn't going to get $1 million. And I think that came into play with Chad increasing Tammy's life insurance, because they didn't have the life insurance they thought they were going to get from Chad or from Charles.
And that's one of the things the government wants to talk about, the prosecution wants to talk about, right. Is that there was financial incentive. It wasn't entirely religious. And I think that they would like to move away from that fact, it being a purely religious motivation, that it was actually somewhat financial. They were looking to get money. They were looking to get rid of inconvenient people. That's what the prosecution is going to say, I think, when we hear openings tomorrow, Monday.
Right. And they wanted to be together. So, the motivation is sex, is money, is religion, all kind of wrapped up together. So Tylee disappears on the 8th of September. Lori tells everyone that she is a student at Brigham Young University, the Idaho satellite campus in Rexburg. And but nobody sees Tylee again. She doesn't answer text messages from her brother Colby, who she's very close to. She doesn't answer text messages from her close best friend, and she's never heard from again. Then on the weekend of September 22nd, Melanie Gibb and her boyfriend, and Melanie Gibb is Lori's best friend.
Let me hold off for just 1 second.
Okay.
I want to get to that. But before we even get to that, I want to talk about something strange that happened the day after Tylee was last seen. Oh. This is on September 9th. And right. First of all, we understand that Alex's phone records show he was on Chad's property, which of course ultimately is where Tylee's body was found. And there's also the strange story of the raccoon text. Do you want to talk about that? The raccoon text, or I can't?
Sure. Okay. Chad and Tammy were not huge texters. Their texts were, okay, bye, hello, yeah, love you too. I mean, they were always very short texts. Just sort of the minimum of what it took for them to communicate. So the FBI folks who were looking at all the phone records found this particular text suspicious at first, just because it was much longer. So the text is something along the lines of, it's been a really interesting day. I decided to go out to the fire pit and burn a bunch of limbs. A little Freudian there, but burn a bunch of limbs before they get wet in the rain. And so I was out there working, and a big raccoon walked along the fence line. For those of you who don't understand, in Idaho, raccoons are vermin that they're invasive and people get rid of them. And so he says, I went and got my gun and I shot this raccoon. And long story short, it's now in our pet cemetery. It's clear that he was trying to explain why he'd been burning something in the fire pit and why he'd been in the backyard, possibly to cover up a gunshot, although it's never been clearly determined whether or not a gun was used to murder Tylee. But it was the following day, and he was clearly doing something in his backyard. Later, we find out Tylee's body is discovered sort of in the area between the fire pit and what had been the family pet cemetery. And her body has been dismembered and attempted to be burned.
And now we can skip ahead to Melanie Gibbs' visit. And the last time JJ is seen by anybody. So let's talk. Melanie Gibb was a close friend of Lori Vallow. She also was friends with Chad through Lori, and came for a visit. She was up there for a conference, and she and her boyfriend of the time saw JJ alive. They didn't see Tylee. Now, they were told the same story, that Tylee had enrolled at BYU, which if it was right there in Rexburg, I don't know why Tylee wasn't present in the house, but I assumed they meant BYU somewhere else. But
no, it's BYU.
But let's talk about Melanie Gibb and that weekend and what she saw.
Okay. So Melanie comes to town for a conference. She and her boyfriend David, they want to do a podcast while they're in town. So the bunch of them get together to do this podcast. When they arrive, they see that JJ is there, and they see him. He goes to school. Then that night, they decide they're going to start this podcast, and it's later in the evening. And JJ is a very hyperactive kid, and oftentimes because he has sensory issues, as the day goes on, he gets a little bit more overloaded. So they want to do the podcast. She calls brother Alex, who comes and gets JJ and takes him to his apartment so they can do the podcast. The last known picture of JJ is of him sitting on the couch eating yogurt, and he has on red pajamas. Later that evening, after they've finished the podcast, Alex comes in and he has JJ asleep on his shoulder. We hope he was asleep, or nobody knows for sure. And JJ had his own bedroom, but he often slept on the floor in Lori's bedroom. So Melanie and David are in JJ's room, and JJ is sleeping in Lori's room on the floor. And I don't recall, somebody woke up in the middle of the night, and they were going to go and try and talk to Lori, and her door was locked. That was the only thing that was a little odd. When they got up the next morning, they were hitting the road to go back to Utah, and asked about JJ, and Lori said he was being a zombie. He was climbing around on the kitchen counters and got up in that space, that pot space above the cabinets, and was crawling around up there. He knocked my picture of Jesus off the refrigerator, and so Alex came and got him and took him to his apartment, because they were saying, "Where's JJ? We'd like to say goodbye." So the last known sighting of JJ was the night before in his red pajamas. In the autopsy, we find out that he was still wearing the red pajamas.
And then two sort of sinister things, or at least concerning things, happen. One is that Lori unenrolls JJ at school, says, "Oh, I'm going to homeschool from now on." And then the second thing is that on October 1st, she rents a storage unit. And that storage unit, a 10 by 10 space, there's video that was available from the storage unit space. And Lori and Alex show up, and they go like 10 times to the storage unit. Alex goes by himself, then Chad and Alex go, then Chad and Lori go. And when it was opened months later, there was a lot of stuff in there related to the kids. You want to talk just a minute about that, what was found?
Sure. JJ's toys, his backpack that was personalized had his monogram on it, some blankets, photographic blankets that had been made for the kids, that were blankets made out of all different photos of each of them. So JJ's and Tylee's blankets both. Some school papers and their bicycles. So clearly, and the police remark when they go into Lori's apartment that there's absolutely no evidence that JJ had ever been there. Even though he had been living in that apartment for some brief amount of time before he disappeared. So by November, when the police finally, Kay Woodcock alerts them that she wants a welfare check, and they go to check on JJ, there's no evidence in the apartment that he ever existed. They find one bottle, a partial prescription bottle of his psych meds.
Wow. So like they were erasing him, basically.
Yep. Absolutely erased both of them.
Wow. That infuriates me. I did not know that. That is really an outrage. And on October 2nd, the day after she rents this storage facility, Lori purchases a wedding ring. That same wedding ring, at least it's believed, is seen on her finger at her wedding to Chad in Hawaii. And I'll show folks, so there's a close-up. You can see the ring Lori is wearing at their wedding. They seem to have a lovely time at the Hawaii wedding. And she goes ahead and she purchases that ring. And of course, she's not married to Chad yet. And in fact, his wife is still alive. His wife, Tammy, is still alive, and she's buying a wedding ring.
So there's a little more interest. There's more interesting facts that go along with that. So during the time that before Charles Vallow died, his sister Kay was helping him with some of his business, and she had access to some of his accounts. One of them was his Amazon account, and she kept getting emails that things had been ordered on his account after he was dead. And that was how she discovered that Lori and the children were in Rexburg, because they didn't tell the Vallow family where they'd gone. So Kay also realized that Lori had ordered on Etsy these malachite and silver wedding bands. The person who was the artist that was supposed to make them then had to cancel the order because something came up and they couldn't make them. She then found them on Amazon. The Amazon searches were also for beach wedding dresses, white wedding clothes. I mean, it was all of the things needed for a beach wedding. And Chad was still married.
And she was doing it out of Charles Vallow's account.
Right. Yeah.
Her now deceased husband, who was shot by her brother. Okay. Right. All right. Well, so now Tammy Daybell on October 9th suddenly dies. She's 49 years old. Now I'll go ahead and put our chart back up so everybody can see. Okay, Tammy Daybell, and you can see Tylee Ryan died September 2019. The exact day is unknown, but it's probably either the 8th or the 9th. And then JJ Vallow dies sometime also in September. It's probably that evening or the next day when Melanie's there. And then Tammy Daybell dies the next month, quite suddenly. She's age 49. And at the time, it's ruled just natural causes. There's not even an autopsy. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Okay. So about 10 days before her death, and I think her death was on the 19th, so I think it was on the 9th, she's coming home from a evening church meeting and unloading meals out of her car and realizes someone is standing there with what she thinks is a paintball gun. And so she posts on Facebook, guys, the weirdest thing happened. There was this guy in a mask at my end of my driveway pointing a paintball gun at me. And he tried to fire a couple of times, but he then, when I yelled for Chad, he ran around the corner of the house. So you have to know that this place where they lived was very rural. They all lived on 4 or 5 acre parcels of land, very rural. So it was kind of odd to have somebody standing there with what turned out to be an assault rifle she thought was a paintball gun. 10 days later, she conveniently dies in her sleep. She had been to visit her parents recently, had appeared to be healthy, was taking a clogging dance class, and was also training to run a road race of some kind. I want to say it was a 10K. So she was running all the time. So, but according to Chad's report, he just woke up and she was dead. Now, again, there are varying stories depending upon who you talk to. His adult son was there and tells a little bit different story. But essentially, she's died in her sleep. So they call the police, and the coroner arrives on the scene. Now, Idaho is one of those places where we have an elected coroner who is not a medical doctor, and usually are not remarkably trained in this. I think it goes back to the Wild West. I mean, so we have a county coroner. She shows up on scene and she asks the family, do you want an autopsy? And they say no. Chad says it was his kids who told him no, but I think he had something to do with it. And the coroner just signs it off as natural causes. So
and we know from the indictment that they are going to say that Alex Cox actually shot at her on the night, that was no paintball gun. The prosecution is going to say that was actually a real gun and it just didn't work. He was unable to kill her that day, but he wanted to. That's going to be a direct allegation. We don't really know the proof they're going to have on that, but we know that's what they're going for.
We know that they've got his cell phone pings, and at different times they place him in close proximity to the Daybell property. So the night that Tammy dies, they place Alex at a church parking lot just a couple miles away from the Daybell house. So we don't know about where he was, where his phone shows he was at the time of the attempted shooting. So within 3 days of Tammy's death, her body has been shipped to Utah and she has been buried. I mean, her whole family were stunned at how fast this happened. I mean, the morning she was discovered, within 72 hours, she was underground. Very fast. And 17 days later, Chad married Lori on a beach in Hawaii.
And we don't really know a lot about the actual way that Tammy Daybell died. That's something that the state has held pretty close to the vest. We don't even know if that's one of the murders where the state has made some hints that they don't know exactly how one of the victims died. So, but we hope that, I certainly think with Tammy, they need to come up with a mechanism of death because they have to prove it's murder. And
so what we know is that in December. So the day before Alex Cox dies, the authorities announce that they're going to exhume Tammy Daybell's body. And they exhume her body, do an autopsy, and rebury her all within about 8 hours. The family is outraged because the children aren't told ahead of time. Their adult children aren't alerted, and everybody's in an uproar because they exhumed her body and she was back in the ground before anybody knew it. So the very next day, Alex Cox is discovered choking and gasping on a bathroom floor, and EMTs arrive. They whisk him to the hospital, but they're not able to save him, and he dies of what is later called natural causes, a pulmonary embolism. Now, there are many people who have died in this group that have died of potential pulmonary embolisms, which is a little suspicious. But Tammy, her death is ruled natural causes, and Chad collects $430,000 in insurance proceeds, marries Lori in Hawaii 17 days later. And they intend to move to Hawaii.
And maybe start that immediately following the welfare check that's called in by Kay and Larry Woodcock.
So Kay and Larry Woodcock call in the welfare check, and it is the day before or the day after Thanksgiving, I'm not positive, when police show up at Lori's door. They find Alex and Lori, Alex and Chad standing outside. They know that Lori has just married Chad just a few days before. And yet when they ask, do you know Lori Daybell? Chad says, well, yeah, Alex says, yeah, she's my sister. And Chad says, well, I don't know her very well. I've just met her a couple times. So the police find the whole thing very suspicious. Of course, JJ is not to be found. Lori says he's with a friend of hers, Melanie Gibb, in Arizona. And as the police start to dig in deeper, they go and get a warrant. They come back the next day with the warrant. Lori and Chad have flown the coop.
And 4 days later, they fly to Hawaii. You do wonder what happened in the 4-day period before they actually decided to leave for Hawaii. What was going on?
They went to LA and went to Disneyland.
They did? Well, they went to Disneyland. Okay.
You know, there was Knott's Berry Farm. I'm assuming Disneyland too, but they went to Knott's Berry Farm. And some of Chad's adult children went with them.
All right. Well, it gets deeper and deeper. It does indeed. So Melanie Gibb then calls the police and on December 6th and she says immediately, JJ is not with me. She says that from the beginning, but on December 6th, she calls him again and she says, look, I want you to know that Lori tried to get me to lie about that, and I want you to know that. And on December 8th, she calls and surreptitiously, secretly records a conversation with Chad and Lori in which she confronts them about the fact that they told the police JJ was with her and JJ was not with her. She says some pretty memorable lines like, that's not being a friend. Telling the police that he's with me, he's not with me. And so that conversation then got played, the audio to that got played at the preliminary hearing for Chad. And so that's going to be evidence. And Melanie Gibb will probably be the state's premier witness for this. It's certainly one of the top witnesses for this trial coming up.
Well, there have been some red flags, maybe for lack of a better, some clues that there are some people in this case that have immunity. So one of their followers, her name is Zulema Pastenis. This case is like the case that keeps on giving. I mean, there's just all these tentacles that spread out. But Zulema Pastenis married Lori's brother, Alex Cox. Because Chad had decided all these people had to be married in order to be part of the 144,000 and go to the celestial kingdom and do all God's work. They all had to be married. because that is a sacrament in the LDS Church. So they'd been married about 2 weeks when Alex Cox died. And Zulema Pastenis, we know, has immunity. I suspect that Melanie Gibb and Lori's niece, Melanie Pulowski, have immunity as well. So, I mean, there are some things that have happened over the life of the case that make me suspicious that they also have immunity deals.
Well, that's interesting. That'll definitely come out at trial. I'll be interested to find out. I wonder what they needed immunity from.
That's a good question.
That's interesting. But so shortly after that, on December 11th, that is when Tammy Daybell's body is exhumed. And
Right.
December 12th, that's when Alex died. You already mentioned that. He was age 51. And then on December 20th, there's the official bulletin that says Tylee and JJ are missing, and Chad and Lori are persons of interest. And they are not cooperating at all with the police. And one of the clear, vivid memories I have is when East Idaho News, Nate Eaton found them in Hawaii and is following them with his microphone. I played it over again last night. He's like, Lori, do you have anything to say to your kids? Lori, where are the children? And he's following her, yelling those questions. And it's interesting to compare because there's body cam of her right after, for example, Charles Vallow is shot. There's body cam of her there. There's body cam of her and audio of when they came to the house for the welfare check for JJ. And in both of those cases, she's chatty, talk. She's lots of extraneous explanations, saying, a lot of extra facts that aren't really relevant or needed, just real chatty. Complete opposite from this point on. She has nothing to say at all about where JJ is, about where Tylee is. Nothing, total silence on that. And that was, I think, ultimately fairly suspicious for a lot of people.
Sure. And law enforcement had put out a bulletin saying these children were missing and endangered. Kay and Larry Woodcock had filed a guardianship action for JJ. Their thinking was that if JJ was found, that they would avoid him being in any kind of foster care because they would step right in. He could go right to them as guardians. So they filed the guardianship action, and the court ordered Lori to produce the children to prove that they were okay. And that deadline passed and she didn't do it. And so the judge issued an arrest warrant, and they went to Hawaii and arrested her. So she came back. She was extradited from Hawaii to Rexburg. And there she sat for almost 3 years.
And I want to zip people through the next few months. There's a search of Chad's home on January 3rd, which yields nothing of interest or importance. Then there's the January 25th when Lori is served with that warrant. She's arrested on February 20th. And there are several months of not a lot in terms of breakthroughs where there's no sign of JJ or Tylee. They're still considered missing. Their bodies haven't been found. And all of a sudden, on June 9th, there is a search warrant issued for Chad's home. And this time, it's the yard. This time, they're out in the yard. And in short order, they find both JJ and Tylee's bodies that were separately buried in different parts of the yard, not far away from each other. And I have a couple of questions about that. Do we have any idea what suddenly caused this brand new search warrant in June?
Well, I will tell you, first of all, they had the cell data from Alex Cox's phone, and they knew that his phone had pinged in Chad's backyard. But I want to set the stage here. When they discovered and started this investigation, it was January in East Idaho. The ground is absolutely frozen solid. And for all of their suspicions, because they were really able to pinpoint his location in Chad's backyard within like 5 feet of where the bodies were. But there was nothing they could do until the temperatures rose to the point where they could actually excavate the backyard. So that was part of it. I think they knew that there were sites that they wanted to look at, sites of interest, because the FBI's mobile crime lab had been in Rexburg for months, since February. So that mobile crime lab was there for a reason, because they knew there was things they wanted to dig in his yard. So that morning, the news broke that something was happening in his backyard. East Idaho News chartered a helicopter and got up over the property and could see what was going on. And it was clear there were blue tarps everywhere. They were bringing in a bulldozer. There were cadaver dogs all over the yard. It was pretty clear that there was substantial evidence in that yard.
Do we know why Tylee and JJ's bodies were treated differently?
No, there's a lot of speculation. There's lots of psychologists who talk about criminal psychology, and we do know that Tylee was very outspoken, that she didn't believe for an instant all of the stuff that her mom was espousing, that she often said, "Mom, you're crazy. You're gonna need a padded room." She says it on tape while they're interviewing her at the police department in Chandler about the mental health hold. So I think we know she was very outspoken. She spoke her mind about things. And I cannot imagine that I can see this. First of all, she may or may not have gotten on well with Charles Vallow. He did think of her as his child. Charles and Lori were married for 14 years. So he was a big part of those kids' lives. But I think she felt like, okay, we can get a clean slate. And within a handful of days, Mom's introducing her to her prophet, Chad Daybell. So I have no doubt that Tylee was not happy about it and didn't like Chad, and I think that may have played a role in it. JJ was much younger, so he was 7, she was 16. But the difference in the way the bodies were handled, JJ was wrapped in many layers of duct tape, but almost lovingly wrapped. And the other thing that's interesting is Chad Daybell was a cemetery sexton. And so he was a grave digger at one point. Yeah.
Yeah.
So he had a lot of experience with bodies.
Right.
And folks out in that area also hunt. So he had a lot of experience with dismembering big game. So it's not outside the realm of possibility that he was involved in the disposal of the bodies in his backyard.
So is there anything else that, just from your experience in the case, you think heading into the trial as we're about to begin, is there anything else you think we ought to know, be aware of, headed into that, be thinking about?
I think what's really interesting is lots of people said, who is dumb enough to bury their victims in their backyard? Who would do that? And Melanie Gibbs said, they believed that the end of the world was coming in July of 2021, that God was going to come again, and the tribulation was going to happen, and there was going to be so much chaos in the world, nobody would notice. Nobody would notice that they had married quickly after Tammy died. Nobody would notice that their kids weren't around. Nobody would pay any attention to them because everyone would be taken up with all of this chaos going on in the world. Well, of course, the 21st of July of 2020 rolled around, and that was, I think, when reality set in for both of them.
And, one of the things that Melanie, when Melanie Gibb recorded that conversation with them, Lori tells her, I know exactly where JJ, is. He's perfectly fine and safe. And of course, we
And happy.
know that. What's that?
And happy.
And happy.
Yeah.
And we know that's clearly completely false. He was dead at the time and had been buried in Chad's backyard. We obviously have a lot of information that we want to find out from the trial. For the first time, the state is going to have to show its cards. We're going to have to get some information about the forensics. We should be learning about not just mechanism of death, but time of death, length of time before the bodies were found, things like that. We ought to get a lot of information about that. So I want to thank Lori Hellis for being on with us today. Next week, we're going to be going into opening statements. We're going to get a lot of surprises, but I really wanted you to have this sort of overview. And I thought that Lori was absolutely perfect to do this for us because she is steeped in this case, someone who will move to Idaho, which to me shows true commitment from my much warmer environment down here. That's some real commitment if you'll move to Idaho for the case. And in fact, you ended up with an extra bonus case being up there in Idaho, didn't you?
Well, yeah, the University of Idaho murders happened a few months ago, and Brian Kohberger was arrested. And I'm certainly going, that one's on my radar, and I'm certainly going to attend his preliminary hearing. It was scheduled for June, but just yesterday they announced that he's waived his speedy indictment. So I don't know when that preliminary hearing will happen. Idaho favors preliminary hearings over grand juries. And so, but of course the prosecutor could circumvent all that by taking it to a grand jury. So I don't know whether, I had planned to go up for the preliminary hearing, but now it likely won't happen.
Okay. Well, that's a shame. Yeah, I was looking forward to learning more about what evidence they have, because we know that's another case where they have kept it completely close to the vest. We really don't know what evidence they have. And, people rush to judgment, and it may well be that Brian Kohberger is exactly the guy. He's the one who did it. But it's hard to make any kind of determination when you have almost no facts. I think it kind of, to me, it's a shame that they hold all of that so tightly, because it leads to rampant speculation with very few facts.
That's true. And the only reason we have as much information about the Vallow Daybell case as we do is because Arizona's rules around Freedom of Information Act are much different. In Idaho, there's an exemption for anything pre-trial. They can hold it back. In Arizona, they can't. And so Arizona did this big dump of information from both Gilbert and Chandler. And that's why we have any information about the Vallow Daybell case.
Well, Lori, you've been an absolutely fabulous guest. I mean, I can't thank you enough. We definitely want you to come back. I know the whole gang. I see people in the chat saying, we want our book. You have to wait for the end of the story. I guess that's part of the problem. It's hard to write the book yet until you know if that's going to happen.
So I'm hoping the book will be out in the fall of next year. I have 6 months to get my editor a manuscript, and then, that we have to go through all of the editing process and all of that. But I'm hoping that we'll be doing some pre-orders over the summer of next year. So
fantastic.
I'm going to be in the trial every day. I have a seat in the courtroom for tomorrow. For those of you who don't know, they required us to go online every day and get a ticket to this court hearing, to the trial. And they have 2 rooms. They have the actual courtroom, and then they have a big overflow room. And there are only 60 seats in the courtroom. And you literally have to go online the instant the window opens up and keep refreshing until you get a ticket. So I managed to get a ticket for the main courtroom for openings. For
congratulations. Yeah. I heard it was sold out in 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
So you had to be there right on time. 2 minutes late and you're out of luck.
Right. I was fortunate. My husband was home, and he's been doing that for me. So he gets online right at 8 o'clock and gets my tickets. So Yeah.
Well, it's been a
Oh,
great show. I really can't thank you enough. It's been fantastic to learn some of the facts. So I am going to put our own Michelle Lisa's outro in as to take us out. Those of you who have been around know that we appreciated Michelle Lisa doing this outro for us. So here we go. Let's see if I can.